The DeFlame diet is about reducing chronic inflammation with anti-inflammatory foods. On the bottom of the front cover of the book, you can see French fries, white bread, and a cupcake, which represent the common pro-inflammatory calories that we consume far too much of. On the top of the front cover, you can see vegetation, and we need to replace our pro-inflammatory calories with vegetation, which represents the most anti-inflammatory of our calorie choices. If we don't do this, over a lifetime, this leads to chronic pain and chronic diseases, many of which are listed on the back cover. And on the bottom of the back cover of the book, you can see additional pro-inflammatory calorie sources. Eating them once in a while is no big deal, but making them a lifestyle is a big problem. And even a simple sit down at a restaurant where you have a few pieces of pizza and some French fries and a Coke leads to an immediate inflammatory reaction. So the next several slides will go over how this inflammatory reaction works. We eat pro-inflammatory foods, and then these calorie sources are broken down into their component parts and find themselves in the stomach. So in the stomach, we end up with increased sugar, flour, omega-6 fatty acids, trans fatty acids, and then these component parts are moved into the small intestine. So in the small intestine, sugar and flour become increased glucose, and omega-6 trans and other fatty acids are represented as increased fat. And then an absorption process takes place. First, glucose gets absorbed and leads to a hyperglucose state or hyperglycemic state, which means too much glucose in circulation after a meal. And then glucose and fat work together to stimulate the bacteria in the small intestine to release one of its component parts. Notice that both glucose and fat work on small intestine bacteria, and the outcome is the release of LPS, also known as lipopolysaccharide, also known as endotoxin. So LPS or endotoxin from bacteria in the small intestine is released when the bacteria are exposed to glucose and fat. The outcome is a post-eating or a postprandial endotoxemic state. Too much endotoxin in circulation, and this occurs with glucose. So within an hour after eating any of those foods listed in box 1 will lead to a hyperglycemic and an endotoxemic state. And this is what initiates the acute inflammatory reaction after doing what I call a drive-by self-shooting with these calorie sources that I call dietary crack. So notice that both glucose and endotoxin stimulate a component in all body cells called NF-kappa B, also known as nuclear factor kappa B. When the nuclear factor is activated by hyperglycemia and endotoxin, any cell exposed to those two will release inflammatory chemicals. And this happens every time we eat pro-inflammatory calories. And initially, you'll have no symptoms. It'll just taste good. But when this becomes chronic, then we can create a chronic inflammatory state that leads to the expression of chronic pain and chronic diseases. So focus in on the bacteria in the small intestine and the hyperglycemia and endotoxemia. As we continue to overeat these calorie sources, these guys increase. So notice what happens. Bacterial amounts increase, circulating endotoxin and glucose increase, more endotoxin is absorbed. When we eat these calorie sources, what helps to increase the amount of endotoxemia is a deficiency in magnesium and omega-3 fatty acids. By avoiding sunshine, we reduce vitamin D levels. By living on sugar and flour, we alter our gut flora. We reduce the amount of anti-inflammatory probiotic bacteria, and the outcome is greater endotoxin absorption. And then this leads to a chronic, sustained elevation of inflammatory chemicals. So this would be called a chronic inflammatory state. And when this happens, these various diseases and more can manifest. So when we live on these calorie sources in a chronic state, day in, day out, and one of the most obvious changes that occurs when we live on these pro-inflammatory calories is weight gain. There are many other markers that indicate that we have an inflammatory state, and they are all described in the DeFlame diet. If you find yourself consuming too many of these calories and are developing some of these symptoms, the main thing to do is to get deflamed to create the best chance at reversing the expression of chronic pain and other associated pro-inflammatory conditions. So my suggestion would be to get a copy of the DeFlame Diet and focus on consuming more of the anti-inflammatory foods in the place of the pro-inflammatory foods. And then you can also follow me on YouTube by subscribing below. You can check out the DeFlame.com website. You can follow me on Facebook at DeFlame Nutrition and on Twitter at DeFlameDoc.